The London branch of Morrison Foerster, a law firm, just paid out £25,000 to a trans man as a result of him filing an anti-trans discrimination lawsuit. Why did they pay up? What does Donald Trump have to do with this? And what does the case mean for trans rights in the UK and elsewhere? That's what we're here to find out. But first, a quick content warning for the following. Transmisia. If work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that I can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I'd also just like to take this time to remind our viewers that statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're fallible. Thus we strive to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in the top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Hi there, mine's Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about Morrison Foerster settling an anti-trans discrimination lawsuit, what happened, why the claimant accepted the settlement, and what this means for the wider political landscape. I feel it acts as a good reminder of just how fickle so-called corporate allyship is, and why they have no place at queer events, such as Pride. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so why don't we go over the case? The Good Law Project published an article on the 25th of September titled "Law Firm That Dropped Trans Man Agrees to Pay Damages and Costs," and features a photo of Donald Trump pointing off screen. The case centered on an unnamed trans man who had approached the Morrison Foerster offices in London to represent him, which they initially agreed to. However, they suddenly dropped said client, seemingly without explanation. Explanation that appeared to finally come when a document was leaked in which their US branch expressed concern to their London counterparts over, quote, the potentially controversial nature of issues raised by the litigation, end quote. This, coming shortly after Donald Trump began targeting various law firms in the US for representing people or groups his administration likes to demonize, including trans people, led both the claimant and the Good Law Project to view this as Morrison Foerster dropping said client because he was a trans man, something which would legally constitute discrimination. That's why the Good Law Project picked up said trans man's case, launching a discrimination lawsuit which sought £25,000 in damages and a declaration that Morrison Foerster had engaged in unlawful discrimination. That latter part would have been particularly devastating for a law firm, particularly one which had previously prized itself as having a good reputation on LGBT+ rights, as the Good Law Project noted Morrison Foerster had prior to this case. That would mean said discrimination wasn't merely ignorance-induced bigotry, but outright betrayal, with Morrison Foerster abandoning trans people the very moment we needed them the most. The Good Law Project likely hopes that the threat of being forced to make such a declaration would pressure Morrison Foerster and other law firms to think long and hard about obeying in advance, something which is important when it comes to beating back fascism, like that spread by Donald Trump. As Timothy Snyder put it in his book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, quote, do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. End quote. The entire thing is, of course, made all the worse in how Trump isn't even a UK Prime Minister, yet the genocidal actions he and his party are engaged in across the US are being called upon as an excuse to abandon trans people within the UK, denying them legal representation for no other reason than their trans status. That is scary, which is what makes cases like these so important. We can't give in to despair. We need to fight back and let corporations like Morrison Foerster know that we won't simply let them get away with it that they will stand judgment and face the consequences for enthusiastically enabling the will of genocidal dictators at the very real cost of marginalized people everywhere. Now, I have to note that Morrison Foerster denies said accusations. They claim they didn't drop their client on grounds of his trans status, asserting that the action had absolutely nothing to do with the political situation in the US. However, when pressed on what they meant by the potentially controversial nature of issues raised by the litigation, they refused to give an alternative explanation. Of course, being a law firm, they have some tricks up their sleeves. Most notably, they forwarded a £25,000 settlement, which the claimant has accepted. £5,000 of that will go to the claimant themselves, whilst the remaining £20,000 went to the Good Law Project, who subsequently divided it 4 ways, donating £5,000 to the Trans Solidarity Alliance, Equality for Trans Families, the Trans Legal Clinic, and the Gender Identity Research and Education Society, all of which are good causes that will make great use of said money. What was not included in the settlement, however, was the declaration admitting that Morrison Foerster had engaged in unlawful discrimination, which is a big shame considering that that's one of the biggest things that could have come out of this, at least in my opinion. A legal service being forced to admit that it discriminated against a client is not a good look and would likely do serious damage to its reputation, far more than £25,000 worth. So that might have some people wondering, why accept the money? Why not push through to get the declaration? Well, it's because of how civil litigation works in the UK. You see, if the defendant offers a settlement which the claimant rejects, that sets a minimum requirement in that, if the claimant is awarded a single penny less than the offer as a result of the trial, they not only have to cover their own legal fees, but the defendant's. That is to say, if this trans man continued in court and won, proving that Morrison Foerster had discriminated against him, but was awarded £24,999.99, he'd then be on the hook for Morrison Foerster's legal fees, which would almost certainly be higher, meaning he'd be the one paying out money. Said procedure is designed, in theory, to stop protracted legal battles from winding up in court, wasting valuable resources, when they could otherwise be settled out of court. Yet, how it plays out in reality is that it allows guilty parties another avenue to threaten the claimant, making it so that, even if they win, the claimant can still be stuck paying extortionate legal fees, which are often close to, if not exceeding, the damages. So it's a shrewd move, since, without a clear ruling, anyone who states definitively that they committed the offence is now liable for defamation, with the UK's draconian system operating on guilty until proven innocent when it comes to defamation. I should know, I have personal experience on that front on YouTube. As the Good Law Project noted in their post, this was the same tactic used against actor Hugh Grant by the publisher of The Sun, a tabloid paper, News Group Newspapers. Hugh had previously moved to sue News Group Newspapers for allegedly paying a private investigator to burgle his home and wiretap his phone, with Hugh being one of numerous celebrities, including UK royalty, in the same boat. And just like Morrison Foerster, News Group Newspapers denied the claims whilst offering Hugh Grant a settlement, this time of £10 million. As Hugh told the press, quote, "I would love to see all the allegations that they denied tested in court, but the rules around civil litigations mean that if I proceed to trial and the court awards me damages that are even a penny less than the settlement offer, I would have to pay the legal cost of both sides. My lawyers tell me that this is exactly what would most likely happen here. Rupert Murdoch's lawyers are very expensive, so even if every allegation is proven in court, I would still be liable for something approaching $10 million in costs. I'm afraid I'm shying at the fence." End quote. before he went on to pledge the £10 million settlement to campaign groups such as Hacked Off. Suffice to say, it's a fucked up system when we stop to think about it, one which allows corrupt groups to sidestep any sort of real accountability by preemptively paying a fine. So there's absolutely no animosity from me towards this trans man or the Good Law Project. They did the best with what they have. Which just leaves us the wider impact, starting, of course, with the good the settlement has still done. Because whilst we cannot definitively say that Morrison Foerster is guilty of discrimination, I think most regular people can look at the evidence alongside their actions in the context of the current climate and make up their own mind to realize that, in all likelihood, they are guilty of just that. Though that is just my personal opinion, maybe I'm alone in that, but I very much doubt it. Either way, it's a good reminder that most corporate allies are only allies when it suits them, and that there needs to be a reckoning with how events such as Pride have been taken over by businesses with a history of abandoning or even harming members of our community. Speaking of history, Morrison Foerster has now been marked by this incident and the reporting surrounding it, meaning that, if more cases were to come forward, that'd add credence to said claims. Hell, just this case being talked about could trigger other people to come forward. So it's not a complete loss in the failure to secure the declaration of guilt on Morrison Foerster's part. This will also act as a warning, both for Morrison Foerster and other law firms, telling them that this sort of discrimination will not be tolerated and that there is a cost should they ever be caught. Because in the world of law, reputation is everything, and to be caught discriminating against a marginalized group will harm the reputation of most law firms. Not all of them, but certainly most. Then, of course, we have the money, which, whilst it might not seem like much to a law firm, will help a lot of people. This is especially true of the £20,000, which was divided between 4 separate trans charities. That is still something, even if I would have wished for more, especially for the claimant. And lastly, and perhaps most mixed, this acts as a warning for the UK about Trump's interference and the reach of his anti-trans violence. The Good Law Project's post was the first in a new campaign they launched to stop Trump's assault on justice in the UK, and will be an important fight to keep track of. So, for as much as a soured victory as this might feel, there was still a lot of good to come from this. People such as the Good Law Project have our back, corporations are still afraid of public perception when it comes to discriminating against trans people, and other corporations are now less likely to feel like they can get away with it. And I think it's important for us to keep a hold of that hope now more than ever. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the case? What other impacts could it have? Do you have any words of support for the Good Law Project? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Bo Ayer, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins the Seagull, Jackie Sins, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.